So we've wrapped up our major discussion about the various types of plants except for one category left. So we've talked about the gymnosperms, and now we need to move on and talk about the angiosperms. So this concept is concept 30.3, and it says the reproductive adaptations of angiosperms include flowers and fruits. Angiosperms are seed plants with reproductive structures that we call flowers and fruits. Although you might find that that definition of the word flower and fruit probably varies a little bit from what you previously thought. They are the most widespread and diverse of all plants, and they're commonly known just as a general category as flowering plants. So we're down to our last category. We've talked about the bryophytes, we've talked about the seedless vascular plants. Now we've talked about the gymnosperms as one kind of seed plant, the naked seeds that don't have the mature ovary fruit, they don't have flowers. And now we're on to the angiosperms, which would be everyone else, and we're going to find out that's the largest category of land plants. All angiosperms are classified into a single phylum. It's called Anthophyta. Anthophyta from the Greek word anthos for flower. And angiosperms have two key adaptations like we already mentioned, both flowers and fruit. So we have, I just chose an apple as a good example. So here are apple blossoms on the right and of course the fruit on the left. The fruit is basically a mature ovary which contains seeds inside. So you're probably familiar with flowers. A flower is basically a specialized structure found in the angiosperm for sexual reproduction, and many species of these plants are pollinated by either insects or certain types of animals, and some of the others are wind pollinated. So some of them rely on bees and hummingbirds and the like, and others simply rely on the wind to carry the pollen from one plant to another. A flower is basically a specialized shoot with up to 4 types of modified leaves. And if you think about, say, a rose blossom or a rose bloom, you can probably in your mind picture these parts. First we have the sepals, which are down at the base of the flower. They're oftentimes green, and if you think about a rosebud before it has opened, it has a green covering, the sepals, and then after the rose blooms, those sepals would be found at the base at the bottom of the flower. They're usually green and close the flower, provide some protection before the bud opens up. The petals themselves, of course, they are usually brightly colored or often brightly colored, and oftentimes have an odor that also is given off to attract pollinators such as bees or hummingbirds. The stamen, which we're going to find out, produces a pollen, and then something called a carpel, also sometimes known as a whole structure as a pistil, which is the female portion we're going to find out, which produces the ovules. The male portion, called the stamen, consists of a stalk called a filament and a little sac on the end called an anther where the pollen is actually produced. The female portion, called a carpel or a pistil, consists of an ovary at the base and a style which would be leading up to the stigma where the pollen is received. And I'll show you a picture in just a moment to kind of sort out some of these terms. So here is a basic flower. This would be considered a perfect flower or an idealized perfect flower. We would call it perfect because it contains both the male and the female structures. Some plants contain flowers that have only the male, some only the female, but in this case we have both, and that's considered, or what we call, a perfect flower. So at the base of the flower we have what was the protective covering at one time, the sepals. Then we have, of course, the petals themselves, usually brightly colored. Then we have the male portion. Altogether this is called the stamen. The stem of that is called the filament, and the top portion where the pollen is called the anther. Then the central portion, or usually central in most plants, altogether this would be the carpel or the pistil, and this would contain the ovules inside. This whole structure is the ovary, and then this neck portion leading up is called the style, and the very top portion that receives the pollen is called the stigma. We have a couple of video clips that are underneath the chapter notes. So if you look under the chapter notes for this chapter and just find, I think there's probably 3 or 4 short video clips. This one is of a flower blooming, kind of a time lapse of a flower blooming, so go take a look for that. And then we already mentioned, in addition to having flowers, these angiosperms have what we call fruits. A fruit's typically a mature ovary, but could also include other parts of the flower itself, depending on what type of plant we're talking about. The fruits protect the seeds and aids in their dispersal, and mature fruits can either be fleshy, like say an apple or a pear, or it can be dry, like for example a dandelion seed or something to that effect. So when you hear the word fruit, you don't want to think just of the apples and pear type variety. A fruit simply means a mature ovary that is around the seed, that protects the seed and allows for its dispersal. Scientifically speaking, there are many more fruits than you just think of in your produce department. So fruits mean more than just apples and pears and grapes and oranges. Here's some great variations in the fruit structure. You can have something like a milkweed or a hazelnut, which would obviously be kind of dry, but these are both versions of fruits. And then we have these that are a little bit more what we keep in mind, or what we think of as fruits in the produce department, like a grapefruit or a nectarine. And then we have other things that a lot of people consider vegetables, but are still actually fruits, such as a tomato or a pea or something like that. Those are actually technically fruits as well. Another great little video clip. If you're watching the PowerPoint, you can right click and hit play. If you don't have access to the PowerPoint, or if you're looking at, say, the PDF of this information, or you're not watching the PowerPoint itself, I think I tried to put most of these little video clips, I believe they're in a Shockwave Flash version, there in the notes folder. So you can right click and hit play, otherwise find the Shockwave Flash folder or the Shockwave Flash file that says fruit development. One of the major reasons for the development of fruit, some of the various fruit adaptations, are to help disperse the seeds so that the parent plants are not in direct competition with the offspring for resources such as sunlight and water, ground space, and that type of thing. So seeds have a variety of ways of being dispersed using fruits. Some of them are carried by the wind, like a dandelion, or some of them are carried by water or animals to new locations. So you may have, for example, certain types of fruits that the animals like to eat. So they'll eat the fruit and ingest the seed, and the seeds generally are very tough and can withstand the digestive tract, and then this little mouse will crawl off somewhere else, and when he goes to the bathroom and poops out those seeds, now the seed is deposited away from the parent plant, plus it has like a beginning stash of fertilizer maybe to help get it going. Here's a type of plant that looks similar to like a sycamore. A sycamore tree produces winged seeds, so they have these little fibrous wings on them, and so when they fall off the tree or they get blown by the wind, they can be carried quite far. And then you're probably familiar with the fact that some types of plants have little barbed, like Velcro or hooks on them. They get stuck on your jeans or stuck on your socks or stuck on your poor dog, and that allows them to be carried further away from the parent plant. If we take a look at the life cycle of an angiosperm, I already mentioned that a lot of times the plants have flowers that are what we call perfect. In other words, the flower of the sporophyte, the plant you see, the diploid plant, is often composed of both male and female structures. We would call that a perfect flower. Other plants have only the male or only the female portions. Male gametophytes are contained within the pollen grains that are produced by that microsporangia of the anthers, and the female gametophyte, or the embryo sac, develops within the ovule that's contained within the ovary at the base of the stigma. Most flowers have some sort of mechanism to ensure cross-pollination. You don't really want the male portion of the flower pollinating the same female portion of the flower. That's not necessarily detrimental, but it's not helpful. You want that crossing of genetics, so you strengthen that genetic pool. So a lot of flowers have different mechanisms to ensure cross-pollination between flowers from different plants of the same species occur. For example, on flowers that have both the male and female parts, sometimes those male and female parts develop at different rates so that they're not ready at the same time, or maybe they're physically arranged in such a way that it makes it unlikely that the male and female portion of the same flower will fertilize together. When a pollen grain does land on the stigma, which is the top portion of the female pistil, either that's going to be taken by perhaps a bee or a hummingbird, or maybe just blown by the wind. When that pollen grain lands on the stigma and germinates, it creates what's called a pollen tube, and that pollen tube will work its way down into the ovary. The ovule is entered by a small little opening, a pore called a micropyle. So within that ovule, there's only one opening, and that's usually at the bottom of the ovule, and that pollen tube will enter that opening, and that will allow fertilization to take place. Double fertilization occurs when the pollen tubes discharge 2 sperm into the female gametophyte within an ovule, and we'll find out that this is actually pretty common in angiosperms, and we'll explain why. So when 2 sperm enter the ovule there, into that area, 1 sperm actually fertilizes the egg itself, so that would create the embryo, which would going on to become the new plant. The other actually combines with two nuclei in the central cell of the female gametophyte, and that initiates of that food storing endosperm. So the one sperm will actually create the embryo itself, which would go on to become the new plant. The other sperm combines with two nuclei that are already there in the gametophyte, and that forms what will eventually be basically, if you were talking about a chicken egg, it would be the white of the egg. It forms the sperm, which is going to be the nutrient that's going to sustain this embryo plant until it has the ability to grow up large enough to do photosynthesis. So this triploid endosperm is what's going to allow that baby plant to grow until it can break through to the ground, form out its leaves, and start doing photosynthesis to provide its own nutrient. Within a seed, the embryo consists of a root and one or two tiny little embryonic seed leaves called cotyledons. So you can even see these if you soak and break apart like a bean seed. Like if you just get some navy beans or pinto beans from the store and you soak them overnight in water, you can take off the outer seed coat, and then you can take apart the two halves if it's like a bean seed, and you'll notice it has two tiny little baby leaves called cotyledons and one root inside. So that would be a dicot, di meaning two. The other type of seed would be a monocot, like a corn seed, and when it sprouts it only shoots up one leaf, mono for one. So here we have a mature flower on the sporophyte plant. If we look at the male portion first, there on the anther is the microsporangium that will produce those microspores, and that would be the pollen grains that we're talking about. The female portion here would be in the pistil, or the area that we were calling the pistil. Down at the bottom of that is the ovaries and the ovules inside, and through a process of meiosis that produces the megasporangium. So we have the megasporangium that is inside here. When one of these pollen grains lands up here on the top, that will produce a long thin pollen tube that will make its way down, and it will fertilize the egg cell inside. So here we have the pollen grain landing on top of the stigma. That pollen tube grows downward through the style and then fertilizes the egg inside. So then we have fertilization occur at that point. Now we have a nucleus developing endosperm around that embryo, and then here we have basically the seed ready to go. It has a seed coat on the outside, it has the endosperm, which is the nutritional material, and then it has the actual baby plant, the embryo, in the middle. If that lands in a good spot, it will germinate, and you'll have either the two little leaves or the one single leaf come out, depending on the type of plant it is. The root will work its way down, and you'll start the life cycle all over again. Great little video clip here, animation of plant fertilization. Look for the SWF file within the notes, or you can right click and hit play. Same thing here as well, seed development. Again, right click and hit play, or look for the Shockwave Flash file within the notes folder for this chapter. And then finally, you should be able to find a movie video clip about the flowering plant life cycle. And again, you can hit play within the video here, or within the PowerPoint, or you can go and find this video file separate within the notes folder. Finally, for this particular concept, let's talk briefly about angiosperm evolution. Darwin himself actually called the origin of angiosperms an abominable mystery, and in his time there wasn't a lot known about how did these flowering plants first come to be. We do know that angiosperms originated at least 140 million years ago, perhaps even further back than that, but we don't have stronger evidence to support going much further back than that. During the late Mesozoic, the major branches of the clade diverged from their common ancestors, and so we begin to get quite a variety of these angiosperms during the late Mesozoic, and by the end of the Mesozoic, the angiosperms actually began to kind of take over and become dominant over the gymnosperms that were dominant prior to that time. Scientists are still studying fossils, refining phylogenies, investigating developmental patterns, trying to kind of resolve this mystery of how did the angiosperms first evolve and develop, and exactly when did they begin, and that becomes more clear with the more fossils we find and the further we study as far as molecular and genetic data. Just like we had the proteo or pro-gymnosperms, we have some angiosperms dating back to about 125 million years ago, some Chinese fossils that show some plants that are very similar to angiosperms but share not all of the traits. In other words, they have some of the traits, but they lack some of the traits of living angiosperms. And they got a good example here. I'm not even going to try to pronounce this. This looks like Archaea fructus senescens. Good enough. For example, has anthers and seeds, but it lacks petals and sepals. So it has some of the parts of modern day angiosperms, but it lacks some of the others. And here's a good example: 125 million year old fossil, and then an artist's reconstruction based on that fossil. And it shows that the plant had some of the parts that we would find familiar with angiosperms today, but it didn't have all of the parts that we find in modern day angiosperms. As far as the phylogeny and how they are evolutionarily related to one another, the ancestors of the angiosperms and gymnosperms diverged probably about 305 million years ago. That doesn't mean that necessarily that angiosperms originated at that time. It just means that we know that was the point at which they had a shared common ancestor most recently. Angiosperms may be closely related to something called bennettitales. They are extinct seed plants with flower-like structures, and amborella and water lilies are likely descended from two of the most ancient angiosperm lineages. So this is some of the information that we're still trying to work out as we gather more fossil data and the like. So if we look at a phylogenetic tree of sorts, we have the living gymnosperms, and this would be the last common ancestor between the living gymnosperms and the current living angiosperms. Then most closely related would be this extinct plant that's no longer around, thus the dotted line. And then here we have the most recent common ancestor of all the living angiosperms, and water lilies and this plant called the amborella would probably be most similar or closely related back to that most recent common ancestor. And then we start to get into a variety of other plants as we go further down the line, and you can see that changes occurred as we move further closer to modern day. I think I already mentioned that angiosperms comprise the largest group of land plants, so they comprise more than 250,000 living species. If you want to take a look on page 630 and 631 of your textbook for pictures and details that talk about some of the angiosperm diversity, we won't go into a huge amount of detail. We will try to look at a few of the examples, but there's a huge amount of variety amongst the angiosperms. Previously, angiosperms were divided into two main groups, the monocots and the dicots. When I was in school, this is primarily how we studied them. They either had one cotyledon, one embryonic leaf, like say a corn seed, or they had two, like a bean seed has two embryonic leaves. We just divided them as monocots and dicots. DNA studies suggest that monocots form a clade, which is a group of organisms believed to evolve from a common ancestor. So they would be like all of the monocots come from one single common ancestor, we believe. But the dicots are polyphyletic, which means a dicot is not all a clade. It's a group of organisms derived from more than one common evolutionary ancestor. So you wouldn't say all the dicots fall under one common ancestor. So we're now kind of subdividing this out, but when I was in high school, we just divided them into monocots and dicots, but we're further subdividing now as we learn more information. So with our more modern understanding, they've actually divided what I would have considered just the dicots as one large group. They've subdivided them into a clade called the eudicots, which would be the true dicots, and that includes most of the dicots. And then the rest of the former dicots kind of form several smaller lineages. So we'll look at something called basal angiosperms, or less derived, and include the flowering plants belonging to the oldest lineages. And magnolids share some traits with basal angiosperms, but evolved later in time. And again, I wouldn't expect you to know a huge amount of detail about every one of these, but we'll look at the ones that we think are most common, and that's where we'll spend most of our time. So the basal angiosperms would be three small lineages that constitute the basal angiosperms. These would be some very older varieties, or varieties that we think are most closely related to the ancient common ancestor. This would be like water lilies and star anise, some cool different plants that we see here. So you might be familiar with water lilies. You may have heard of star anise. These will be your basal angiosperms. Basal meaning the word that means like base or near the bottom. The magnoloids include, of course, you could probably guess, magnolias, also laurels and black pepper plants. Magnolids are more closely related to the monocots and eudicots than they are the basal angiosperms. So you're probably familiar with the southern magnolia, probably the most common one there. Then we have the monocots. The monocots would be the ones that put out a single embryonic leaf. More than 1/4 of the angiosperm species are monocots. This would include lots of your grasses. This would include things like wheat and corn, and this would include things like orchids and lilies. All of these would be considered monocots. And then finally we get to the eudicots. The eudicots are 2/3 of the angiosperm species, and they would be considered now the true dicots. So the monocots, like the grasses and the corn, those are the ones you're probably most familiar with, and now what we call the eudicots, or the true dicots, probably familiar with them as well. This would be such a huge variety, everything from roses to peas to zucchini to oak trees to this California poppy flower that you see here, a massive variety of different types of plants. And if we wanted to compare the monocots and the eudicots, which would have been in my time what we call the dicots, but now it's separated a little bit further. If we compare the two, the embryo of a monocot, mono meaning one, has one cotyledon, and in a dicot, 2 cotyledons. On the leaves, the veins are usually parallel. Like for example, if you look at, say, a piece of grass, which is a monocot, the leaf veins tend to run parallel. On a eudicot, they tend to run in a net-like fashion. Think like an oak tree or a maple tree. In the stem, the vascular tissue tends to just be scattered throughout the stem, and in the eudicot, the vascular tissue tends to be arranged in a ring, like you see here. If we compare the roots of a monocot, they tend to be very fibrous with no main root. Again, think about like grasses. You compare that to a eudicot, which tends to have one main root called a taproot, usually present. So think of a tree or something like that that generally has one large main root with smaller roots coming off of it. If you look at the pollen of these plants, the pollen grain of a monocot usually has a single opening. The pollen grain of a eudicot usually has actually 3 different openings. And the flowers themselves, the flower organs or the floral organs of the monocot usually are in multiples of 3. And on a eudicot, the floral organs are usually in multiples of 4 or 5. These are not completely hard and fast rules, but they are basics that would kind of help you separate these 2 different types of angiosperms. When you think about the evolution of these flowering plants in particular, it's interesting to think about the link between these flowering plants and the animals that pollinate them. Animals have actually had an influence on the evolution of these plants and vice versa. For example, animal herbivory, which is the eating of plants, animal herbivory selects for plant defenses. So of course plants who want to survive have to fend off animals that might eat them. So there's kind of this constant arms race between predator and prey that you see throughout nature. And so certain plants that produce certain sorts of toxins or smells or have thorns, that's all in an attempt to try to prevent being eaten by herbivores. So you kind of have this influence between the evolution of both the plants and the animals. And then for example, the interaction between the pollinators such as bees and hummingbirds and the flowering plants selects for mutually beneficial adaptations. So there are different types of adaptations to the point where now you have certain insects only pollinate certain flowers, and they've developed this relationship, and over hundreds and thousands of years of evolution they have become to the point where they can't hardly live one without the other. So it's kind of neat to see this link between these plants and these animals, how they have evolved over time. In the online, if you look inside for this particular chapter, look inside the folder there and you can find these video clips of one. Here's a bat pollinating an agave plant, and then here is a bee pollinating a flower. So take a look, try to find those clips as well. And then here's an interesting example your textbook shows. This is a particular type of plant called a monster flower of Indonesia. There are a couple different varieties of these, which some of them are called like a rotting corpse plant or a stinking corpse plant, and some of them can be 2 or 3 feet across. These enormous flowers that only bloom every once in a while. This particular one is called a monster flower. It's the size of an automobile tire, and it actually uses flies as its pollinator. So instead of these nice beautiful smells that might attract bees or hummingbirds, it actually smells like rotting meat or like a decaying corpse. And the reason for that is it uses flies as its pollinators. So there's a couple different varieties of these very interesting corpse plants that put off a stench that would probably make you gag. but of course they're not trying to attract you. They're trying to attract the insects that would pollinate, such as beetles and flies. So again, a great evolutionary link between these two different types of living creatures with the angiosperms and the flowering plants. Alright, we're going to take a break right there. We're going to go over one last short little concept about how human welfare actually depends a lot on seed plants, and we'll wrap up this chapter. So we'll take a quick break, come right back.